Okay, I guess we'll get started now.
Okay. Shalom Aleichem. My name is Cyril Troster, and on behalf of the UJA Committee for Yiddish, I want to welcome everyone to our first webinar of the fall season. I want to introduce our speakers for our Summer of Tkhines program. Rabbi Marna Sapsowitz was ordained in 1989 and has spent most of her professional life as a congregational rabbi. She served the congregation in Olympia, Washington for 13 years and spent 6 winters as a snowbird rabbi on St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. She has also worked with liberal and progressive congregations in Prague and Warsaw. Currently, having failed retirement, she works per diem as a Jewish hospice chaplain in Seattle. Sharon Power is a Yiddish teacher and translator in Southwestern Ontario, Canada. She received her MA in Women's Study from York University in 2010 and studied Yiddish at the graduate level at Columbia University in New York. She's been teaching Yiddish in the community for 14 years and currently teaches the online Intermediate Plus and advanced classes for the UJA Committee for Yiddish. She's also been an active board member for the Committee for Yiddish for over a decade. And now I will turn the session over to Sharon and Rabbi Marna.
Well, you said good afternoon. I'll say good morning. So about 30 years ago, my synagogue absorbed what holy books and other items remained when another congregation closed its doors. Almost all their sidurim were so tattered and mildewed that they needed to be buried. But among them, I found a small book of Tkhines, small enough perhaps to be slipped into someone's apron pocket, published in New York in 1916, and I saved it from burial. I knew enough to identify it, but not to read it, and it sat there on my shelf these many years. When I told Sharon in early 2023 of my interest in studying Tkhines, her response was that while she knew of their existence, she had never studied them, and that as a secular Jew, she didn't feel competent to teach them, but maybe we could explore them together when she was not doing her formal teaching come summer. And so that's what we did, running a study group together, 2,600 miles, 4,200 kilometers, and 3 time zones apart from each other, inviting others from our respective Yiddish circles to explore them with us. Jews in the old country always prized learning, and literacy was almost universal. But while most boys went to cheder and learned Hebrew and maybe Aramaic, many girls learned to read only Yiddish. Around the late 1500s, the idea arose that since women were required to pray, since God presumably understood Yiddish, it might make sense for women to pray in the Mama Lashon, in the mother tongue. And we have examples of Tkhines beginning in that period, some apparently written by men for women to pray, others actually written by women. We had fun choosing which Tkhines sounded most interesting to us and cobbling together a list that would cover both the basics and what Sharon described as those juicy little curiosities that reveal so much about the social conventions and expectations for women in the time and place in which they were written and intended to be used. Most of the Tkhines came from the Shas Tkhina Rav Paninim. This is the book I found, the first book of Tkhines published in America in 1916. Random page here. So the most straightforward Tkhines are parallels to, and in many cases, direct translations from prayers in the Hebrew liturgy. And we read a few of those. We anchored ourselves in Jewish time by reading the Tkhina for Rosh Chodesh Av, the new moon of the Hebrew month of Av, when our group met on that date. And as the High Holy Days approached, we readied ourselves with the Tkhina for shofar blowing. We read a couple of Tchinas that center on the three mitzvahs traditionally assigned to women: challah, the separating of dough from the Sabbath bread; nida, the laws regarding ritual menstrual impurity; and lichtzindin, Shabbos candle lighting. We spent most of our time on what we found the most fascinating, the topical, historical Tchinas. Tchina to be said upon hearing bad news of a pogrom from the old country. One for a woman who goes out to collect tzedakah, asking God to open people's hands so that they might give to her generously. Another to be said by a woman who can no longer live on her own and must bear the indignity of living with her married children. We read a Tchina to be said when a plague breaks out, which seemed timely as COVID lingered. And then Sharon found a contemporary gebet published online in Hebrew, Yiddish, English, and Hungarian to be said upon receiving a vaccine, which paired with it nicely. There are poignant Haskaras Neshamas memorial prayers for the victims of the Titanic and of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, both tragedies that occurred shortly before the book was published. There's a Tchina for an aguna, an abandoned or anchored wife. There's one to ward off an evil eye. And Sharon's favorite was one to be said by a bride before the chuppah, and so many more. We wish we had more time to share more than just a few of our favorites with you.
Thank you so much, Marna. As you said, I must admit, I didn't know much about Tchinas when we embarked on this project. I am Jewish, but I had a largely secular upbringing, and I am secular as an adult. So when Marna approached me to facilitate a study group together about Tchinas, I was both curious and trepidatious. I trusted Marna, though, to help us through the religious and spiritual aspects of the prayers, and I really enjoyed working together with her to discuss those Tchinas that interested us the most, and we're going to show you some of those today. So first of all, some of you may be curious as to where and how we source the material for this group. Everything we read is freely available online and for download, and we encourage you to follow up and seek out these sources yourselves, and you can email us afterwards to discuss that further. As Marna mentioned, the core text for our study group was this book published in New York in 1916 by the Hebrew Publishing Company called Shas Tchina Rav Paninim. And we downloaded this book from the National Yiddish Book Center Digital Archive. This was the first collection of Tchinas published in America, and it contains a number of newly written Tchinas, specially commissioned for this text, that we're going to show you a couple of those a little bit later on. We also looked at several Tchinas that are posted on the Open Siddur project, opensiddur.org, and they have a Tchina section. And we looked at some older texts, so we're going to show you a couple of those. For example, Cyril Rappaport's Tchina of the Matriarchs, which was written in the 18th century. And a lot of these older texts are available from the National Library of Israel Digital Archive, the NLI. So before we go to some of these Tchinas, I just want to tell you a little bit about how we structured our group and how it functioned. So first of all, we have to keep in mind this was an extremely diverse group. We've had fully secular folks to fully religiously observant folks. We had those who didn't know anything about Yiddish, did not understand at all any Yiddish, to those who were more advanced learners than even native speakers. So how do we bring those together in a way that centers the Yiddish text? That was important to both Marna and I. So we would have those who would read from the original text. I would help with the Yiddish. Marna would jump in to help us with the Lashon Kodesh, the Hebrew. And then we would sort of make a translation and discuss what we were reading, discuss the references to Tanakh, other religious texts, spiritual practices. And then after reading, we would have a lively discussion in English about the text. So in this way, those who didn't know any Yiddish were still able to access the text in the original language, and we could all learn from each other and our different perspectives. I also want to mention that without Marna's help, I would never have been able, or comfortable to teach religious material like this. And so I would have missed out on a rich and exciting genre of Yiddish literature that was totally unknown to me before this. So on that note, we're now going to go through a few examples, reading them in Yiddish and English, of some older Tkhines, some newer Tkhines that we read in our group, so you can experience this genre of Yiddish literature for yourselves. And during our presentation, we would ask you if you have comments or questions about any of the Tkhines or anything we say, to please type them in the Q&A box. We're going to leave some time at the end of our presentation to go through the Q&A and answer as many of your questions as we can. And we'd love to hear what you think about what we're reading. So without further ado, we will start reading some Tkhines. This is a page just of some of our resources, our primary text, other resources, and articles and information on Tkhines. There's, in fact, a journal article about this particular book of Tkhines, the 1916 book by Judy Tider-Balmo-Schwartz, which is very interesting. So the first Tkhina that we're going to show you is a prayer that was to be read when the Torah is taken out on Rosh Hashanah, when we take out the Sefer Torah. And this is from a book called Tkhina of the Matriarchs by Cyril Rappaport. So here's a front cover of a version of this book published in Zhytomyr in 1848. We actually use a slightly different version because the internal text was a little clearer, but this is a nice cover page, so you can take a look at it. So the Tkhina Emos min Rosh Chodesh Elul, Tkhina of the Matriarchs for the new moon of Elul is the full title of this text. And this text was originally written probably in the late 18th century, from what we know, by a woman named Cyril Rappaport. Her husband is Rabbi Mordecai Katz Rappaport in Oleksiniec in southern Poland around the late 1700s. So that's where we can date this book. She was a very learned woman. She was a Rebbitzin, probably the Fürsorgerin in her husband's synagogue. She led the women in prayer, and she wrote a number of original prayers. She was also the daughter of a famous rabbi. So the contents of this book, just to tell you a little bit about it, most of it is something called a Naya Tkhina, which is to be recited every day during the month of Elul, including Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And there is a separate prayer, which we're going to show you a bit of, which we read in our group, which is to be recited 3 times when the Sefer Torah are taken out. And there's also a small psalm in this book to be recited before hearing the shofar. So we've taken a little excerpt from the text, and what we're going to do is what we would do in our group. I'm going to read it in Yiddish, and then Marna will read it in English translation, and then we'll share our thoughts with you about what we're reading. So the text is as follows. Rabbeinu Shalom, denn azoi wie mir tun et sind, ois nehmen die Sefer Teure, azoi sollst du uns schreiben in Sefer Chaim und in Sefer Broche, azoi wie man wettet sind lehnen in der Sefer Teure, wie du hast zugehört zu der Tfile von unserer Mutter Sura Rosh Hashanah, azoi sollst du unser Tfile euch makabel sein Rosh Hashanah.
Master of the universe, just as we do now, take out the Sefer Torah, so may you inscribe us in the book of life and the book of blessing. Just as we now read in the Sefer Torah how you heard the prayer of our mother Sarah on Rosh Hashanah, so may you also receive our prayer on Rosh Hashanah.
Und euch wollen wir lernen in der Sefer, wollen wir lernen in der Haftorah, wie du hast zugehört die Tfile von unserer Mutter Hannah, also sollst du zuhören unser Tfile heutigen Tag.
And we'll also read in the Haftorah how you heard the prayer of our mother Hannah, so may you hear our prayer today.
Und euch hast du dem heutigen Tag Rosh Hashanah herausgenommen dein Knecht Josef HaTzadik von der Tfisa, also sollst du heint uns euch herausnehmen von dem schlechten Ding. Euch hast du angeschrieben in dein Teure, als alle Teuren wären verschlossen, nur die Teuren von Tränen wären nicht verschlossen.
Also on this day of Rosh Hashanah did you free your servant, the righteous Yosef, from prison. So may you also free us from being judged badly today. You also wrote in your Torah that all the gates are locked, but the gate of tears is not locked.
Darum tun wir zu dir schreien und weinen, der Herr unser Gebet, und schreib uns an zu ein gesund Jahr, du sollst uns Cholile nicht wegnehmen von der Welt vor 70 Jahr, gedei wir sollen Cholile nicht losen kein kleine Jesäumen. Wir sollen kennen sie erziehen, sie sollen lernen die heilige Teure von dein heiligen Namen wegen, und sollst euch nicht wegnehmen unser kleine Kinder bei unser Leben.
Therefore do we cry and lament, hear our prayer and inscribe us for a healthy year. May you not, God forbid, take us away from this world before 70 years old, so that we will not, God forbid, leave young orphans behind. May we be able to raise them so they will learn the Holy Torah for the sake of your holy name. May you also not take away our young children during our lifetime.
Yeah. So Marna, what did you think of this prayer? Any thoughts?
First of all, these are just short excerpts. So, we read Sarah and Hannah and Yosef, but there's all the patriarchs and all the matriarchs and a few other characters from scripture. It's actually quite a long prayer. It's poignant, and in particular, this screen that you've got up now. May we not die and leave our children orphaned, and may we not lose our children, like kind of the two most horrific scenarios that people feared then and that people fear today. I also think it's quite delicious. May you not, God forbid. It's kind of
right, yes. I do think it's interesting that it's we, because a lot of the other Tkhines we read, I'm noticing this, are first person, are I. So it is interesting that maybe as a Rebbitzin, maybe as a Fürsorgerin in the shul, she's used to speaking for a group of women. So there's an interesting plurality in this one that I noticed. Yeah, so interesting just to notice for these older prayers, you can see how the concerns of children surviving to adulthood would be really a primary concern. I mean, the chances of losing a child are actually quite high. And I like how she combines sort of the spiritual, the scriptural with this very, very personal cry. And she goes on after this, please don't take away my husband, please don't, it just goes on and on and on. So it's very sweet, and it's very interesting, I think, for the time that it was written. And the fact that it was written by a woman to be recited by women. So we're going to transition next to another earlier Tkhina, one that is quite famous. So this is the Three Gates, the Shloisha She'arim Tkhina, written by Sarah Bas Tovim, who you may have heard of. She's one of the more popular writers of Tchinas who are women. And interestingly, we actually read this in the 1916 book. So I'm going to show you that text, which is a lot cleaner to read, but you can go back and read it in the original, well, in reprinted books from the original. But it was so popular that it's been reproduced in all the Tchinas produced right through to the 20th century. And
I guess there weren't copyright laws that applied in 1869.
They were all taken from many sforim, as they say. So it's always cobbled together and recycling. That's how all of these old sforim were produced. And yeah, there was definitely no copyright. But everyone would know Shloisha She'arim would be Sarah Bas Tovim, I think. And interestingly, she was so famous that later in the 19th century, Maskilim, Enlightenment writers of Tchinis would put her name on their texts as a pseudonym, just to get the sales, get the word out, right? So she's attributed to more books than she actually wrote. Let me tell you a little bit about what we know of Sarah Bas Tovim and this book. This is the frontispiece from a version from Vilna, 1869. As I said, we read from the modern text because it's just a lot easier to read. So, I can keep that up. Let's see, what do we know about her? She is from village Satanov in Podolia, which is now in Ukraine. She's the great-granddaughter of a rabbi, Rabbi Mordecai of Brisk. Other personal details differ from version to version. So interestingly, as Chava Weissler notes, there was some doubt as to her existence. There was a time when people believed that women couldn't write Tchinas. So this must have been a pseudonym. And there, as I said, there are a lot of texts which are clearly not hers, which were attributed to her. But later on, there were definite authentications of women writing Tkhines, so there is no reason to doubt that this person actually existed. It's quite an autobiographical text, which is very interesting. She describes her whole life, not in the section we read, but in the book itself. And this is probably written mid 18th century, so from 1750s. We don't have exact dates, but that's what's thought. She wrote two main books. There's another one, which is called the Techina of the Gate of Unification Concerning the Eons, which is to be recited on Mondays, Thursdays, and fast days. And then this one, Shloisha She'arim, the Three Gates. If you're curious, what are the three gates? The first gate are the three women's mitzvahs that Marna outlined for us. The second gate are the Yomim Nuroim, the days of awe. And the third gate is Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. So there's all kinds of parts in here. We're going to read a little section from the first gate of the women's mitzvahs just for the candle lighting. It's really interesting. So let's take a look at that. We'll read it together. And then after this, we're going to show you a more modern prayer for candle lighting, just to be able to compare. So, Rabbeinu Shalom, mein Mitzvah von die Licht anzünden soll so angenommen sein, wie die Mitzvah von dem Kohen Gadol, was hat die Licht in Lieden Beis Hamikdash angezündet. Ner leragli devorecho ve'or lensibosi. Das ist Teich, deine Rede ist so wie ein Licht zu meine Fies.
Master of the universe, may my mitzvah of candlelighting be accepted, as was the mitzvah of the high priests when he kindled the lights in the dear holy temple. Your word is a lamp to my feet, a light for my path. That's from Proverbs, by the way. This means your words are like a light at my feet.
Und meine Kinder sollen gehen in Gottes Weg, und die Mitzvah von meiner Lichtzinden soll angenommen werden, als meine Kinders Augen sollen leuchten in der Liebe heiliger Teure.
And may my children walk in God's path, and may the mitzvah of my candle lighting be accepted so that my children's eyes illuminate in the dear holy Torah.
Euch tu ich beten bei die Licht, dem lieben Gott Baruch Hu, als mein Mitzvah von die Licht soll angenommen werden wie das Licht, was hat gebrennt von dem Bäumel in Beis Mikdash und ist nicht verloschen geworden.
I do also plead by the candles to dear God, blessed be he, that my mitzvah of the candles be accepted, as was the light which burned from the oil in the holy temple and was not extinguished.
Beschus das Licht von dem lieben Shabbos soll megen sein, wie der liebe Shabbos hat megen gewinn auf Adam Harishon, wie ist behit geworden von a gichen Teut, azoi soll unser Schuss von die Licht megen sein, als unsere Kinders Augen sollen leuchten in der Teure.
By the merit of the candles of the dear Sabbath, may we be protected, just as the dear Sabbath protected Adam. Just as he was protected from an early death, so may our merit of the candles ensure that our children's eyes light in the Torah.
Ihre Mazoles sollen leuchten im Himmel, sie sollen kennen Parnosse geben, die Weib und Kinder bei ein Joffe, und alle unsere Mitzvahs sollen angenommen werden, wie die Mitzvahs von unserer Oves für Moas und die Schwotim Akdushim. Wir sollen sein so rein wie ein Kind, der geboren von seiner Mutter. Amen.
May their lucky stars light up in the heavens so they will be able to provide a generous livelihood to their wife and children. May all the other mitzvahs be accepted as were the mitzvahs of our forefathers and foremothers and the holy tribes. May we be as pure as a child when he is born from his mother. Amen.
So, Marta, what do you think about this one?
Also, the concern about early deaths jumps out, and concern that we see a lot for parnasa, for livelihood. There are kind of threads that go through all of them through the many centuries.
Yeah, I think this one is really a beautiful prayer. I think, I'm sorry, Rebitz and Cyril, but I actually think this one is more beautifully written. I love the metaphor she uses. I just think it's richer in language. So you can see that a prayer is not a prayer is not a prayer. Some of them are
Wait,
quite
what?
they're written differently. You know, like a poem is not a poem. They're all poetry, they're all prayers, but I think this one is quite beautiful. I just really like the images of it. The same, yeah, the same themes, combination of the personal pleas for healthy and successful children with the religious references. But this one, just, I like the imagery she uses. I think it's really beautiful. That's what I say about this one. So now what we're going to do, something a little fun. We're going to show you a modern version, a very different candlelighting prayer. And this is called a Neue Tkhine von Lichtbändchen, Spezial für Amerika. So this was one of the newly commissioned prayers for this 1916 book, which, as I said, was our main text. And there were many of these delightful Neue Tkhines. So here's the, if you're curious, here's the frontispiece. We're not going to go through the whole translation of what's on here. This is the title page. Basically, there's all kinds of other books. I don't know if you saw when Marna showed it up. There's like a line, and at the bottom are all of these edifying texts. Muser, all kinds of other little texts are printed at the bottom, and this is a list of all the other texts that are there. But it's a 176 Neue und alte Tkhines und Misholim. So 176 new and old Tkhines and parables, right? Taken from many midrash, Sefer Muser, all kinds of places. So very legit. And what they did was, yeah, Marna.
No, and when we each independently made a list of our favorites, this was the one that we both chose.
This was both of our favorites, so it had to come into our presentation today. Absolutely. So this man, Aaron David Agus, was, according to Tider Baumel-Schwartz, that article, she did some investigating and found that he was the man probably commissioned to write most of these new Tkhines. And there is an article on him in the Lexicon of Yiddish Writers. So we know a little bit about him. I don't have his death date because he died after the lexicon was published. And there's no Wikipedia entry on him. But he was born in Grodno, 1865, Grodno region. And he came to America in 1896, as a young man. And he did all kinds of things, peddling, making windows, et cetera, ended up writing. So he ended up at various newspapers, the Daily Herald, the Jewish Herald, the Wahrheit, and then ultimately the Morgen Journal, which is a Yiddish newspaper where he remained for many decades. And interestingly, he's known for comedy. He writes humoresques, he writes little satires, little folksy stories, very popular in his day. Wrote a number of books, a number of translations, collections of satirical little meiselech. So it is interesting that he was commissioned to write these prayers because they are very serious. They are not funny. It's just interesting to know and to think about that. So here's the man behind the words. Before that, I just want to go back a little bit. I just want to mention there are 4 or 5 different candlelighting Tkhines in this book. We've got parts of Sarah Bastuvim's 3 Gates, which we read for you, and parts of a more newer version of Tkhina for candlelighting, which are original but probably lifted from 19th century texts. There's an order of candlelighting, which also has parts of the 3 Gates. There's a new Tkhina for candlelighting, which is very traditional. And then there's this new Tkhina for candlelighting, Spezial für Amerika, special for America, which is more modern. So that's the one we're going to read, but keep in mind it's of a series of other Tkhines. So this is what we're going to read for you. An excerpt from this. So this is one little section, then we're going to skip ahead. Heintober seinen mir in Golis, wo die Tirdas Haparnosse, die Sorg von Chayuna is sehr groß, und Umständen bringen oftmal, als man kann nicht halten Shabbos und Yontev wie der Din is.
Today, however, we are in Golis, we're in exile, where the hassle, the effort of making a living, the worry about livelihood is very great. And circumstances often mean that we can't observe the Sabbath and holidays according to the law.
So skipping ahead just a smidge. Die Redifes, was wir haben gehabt, auszustehen in andere Länder, haben uns vertrieben nachher in Amerika. was dient als ihr Miklat für die Verfolgte und Gepeinigte.
Persecutions which we've had to endure in other lands have driven us here to America, which serves as a place of refuge. Interestingly, Ir Miklat is the language from the Torah for the cities of refuge, a place of refuge for the persecuted and tortured.
Aber der Leben kommt da an sehr schwer. Und ba'avoneseinu harabim müssen jüdische Kinder mechalo Shabbos v'yontev sein. Ich beschuldig cholila keinem nicht, als sie tun das kedei zu der zernen dich, kedei zu lästern dein heiligen Nomen.
But life here is very difficult, and oftentimes Jewish children must violate the Sabbath and holidays. I accuse, God forbid, no one that they're doing it in order to anger you, in order to blaspheme your holy name.
Aber die Zeit und die Umstände bringen das mit. Sie tun das lechatchile aus Neute und nachher aus Gewohnheit. Also wie die Gemara Hakdusha sagt, wenn ein Mensch tut einmal eine Wehre und noch einmal, wird es schon bei ihm also wie ein Hater.
But the times and circumstances bring this about. They do this at first out of necessity, I would say, and later out of habit. As it says in the Holy Gemara, when a person commits a sin one time and then again, it is already as if he has permission to do it.
Bete ich dich, Gott von Abraham, von Yitzchak und von Jakob, als du sollst mich, mein Mann und meine Kinder, behitten und beschirmen von Chilul Shabbos v'yontev.
So I beg you, God of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to defend and guard me, my husband, and my children from desecrating the Sabbath and the holidays.
Schick uns zu unser Parnosse, benaches v'lo bezar, beheter v'lo beisser, und wir sollen Cholile zu lieb Chayuna nicht darfen machen dem Shabbos oder Yontev wochedig. Und wir sollen können ruhen in die heilige Tag und dienen dich mit dem ganzen Herzen.
Send us our livelihood in ease and not in sorrow, by permission and not by prohibition. And may we not, God forbid, due to livelihood, have to make the Sabbath or holidays ordinary, and may we rest on the holy days and serve you with our whole heart.
Wonderful. So we probably have a lot to say about this one. Marna, you want to start with your thoughts?
I just find this so, I don't know, wrenchingly poignant. You know, the discovery that the streets are not paved with gold, and that you're now living in a world which requires you to work on Shabbos and holidays, and that's really the only way you're going to be able to put food on the table and keep body and soul together. And asking God's forgiveness. And I also think that you know, with this very last snippet, there's this delicious irony. There's, you know, God, we don't want to desecrate your holy days. We do it unwillingly because we have no choice. And God, you know, like if you could see fit to help us out a little bit in the realm of Parnasa, in you know, helping us to have a little bit more and to earn a slightly better living, then maybe we wouldn't have to be desecrating your holy days. Maybe we wouldn't be forced to do that, and we would once again be able to observe them the way we want to and the way you want us to.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I love this one too, of course. I do think it's interesting how we can compare it to the other candlelighting Tkhines, and we can really see that shift in concern for the immigrant women in America. What were they most worried about? Of course, chayuna, parnosa, earning a living, making ends meet. And also we can see this concern. I don't know how much of a concern it was for the women versus for the author, but we can definitely see a concern about acculturation, about losing one's Jewishness in America, right? How easy it is, particularly when need drives one to it, to just abandon Jewish practice, observant practice as one would want. So this prayer is it's trying to find a middle path. It's really interesting. If you read the whole prayer, for me, I can see a kind of permission structure in here that allows working on Shabbos and Yom Tov if absolutely necessary for survival, as long as one's heart is in the right place. There's a little bit of there's a little understanding that sometimes it's absolutely necessary, but we wish we didn't have to do it. We'd prefer not to do it. We're definitely not doing it to blaspheme anybody or to run away from Jewishness. There's a little hole in there that it's okay to do it.
Yeah, but then we'll get in the habit, and that would be really bad.
It's risky. There's a risk that we're walking on a knife's edge here in this one, right? We're definitely, the author is concerned about how easy it could be. But it's like, if you don't address it, if you don't talk about it, if you don't have some permission for it, then it's possible that the immigrants would just turn away. So how do we sort of hang on to them and say, it's okay, we understand? It's a really interesting text. It tells us a lot about—
Fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating, yeah.
So that was our traditional candlelighting, not traditional candlelighting text. We want to show you one more in our formal presentation. If there's extra time, we have more, but we have one more formal set of Tkhines that we're going to show you, and then we can look at the Q&A or look at more Tkhines if there's time. And these are more new Tkhines, and these are related to the Titanic, just because they're so interesting, so delightful. They are part of a series of memorial prayers, the Haskora Neshomas. There's a whole series of them. Marna mentioned some of them in her intro: for pogrom, for those who die in pogrom, for those who die in war, for those who die in fire, which honors the triangle, shirtwaist factory fire, all kinds of various deaths that we have memorial Tkhines for. And there are two here related to the Titanic. So we're going to show you a little excerpt from each of them, because they're both really fascinating. One is for the general sinking of the Titanic. That's this one. Anaya Haskoras Neshomas Tkhina for der Trunkene in Yam. A new memorial prayer for those drowned in the sea. And again, these are both from this 1916 book. And then there's one which we'll also show you a little bit from and then discuss, which is specifically for the story of Ida and Isidor Strauss. We'll talk about them in a moment. First, we'll read this one. You may or may not remember that. Oh, sorry, Marna.
It's a little bit graphic.
Okay, yeah, a little warning. Interestingly, all of these new Haskoras are extremely graphic. There are some which are almost, you have to put them down. They're almost too difficult to read, about terrible deaths, which are described in graphic detail. This is not that graphic, but it's fairly graphic. It's more graphic than you might expect. Thank you for the warning. A little warning in advance, because it's very interesting. Some of them are very graphic. They're really designed to elicit a reaction in the reader, a real visceral feeling. I'm very surprised at how graphic some of them were. This one's not that bad, but it does describe some graphicness. Before we start, just to mention, the sinking of the Titanic, the date, if you don't remember, was April 15th, 1912. Remember, this is 1916. It was still in the popular culture. It was still really actively talked about, I think, in the zeitgeist by 1916 when this was published. You got to put current events in your new book, right? You got to have people buy it, got to be interesting. It was very much talked about in Jewish circles. Some of you may know that. There was lots published in the Yiddish press, in the English press, in all kinds of languages press, in synagogue sermons. There's a song, Churban Titanic, or der Nasser Kever, the disaster of the Titanic, or the watery grave, a Yiddish song, which was quite popular. So it was around, it was in the zeitgeist. So they made memorial prayers for that, which I think is super interesting and fun. So they all start like with this Yizkor Elohim, right? Yizkor Elohim, soll Gott der Monen jene Kedushim, was seinen umgekommen auf der Schiff Titanic. Und Gott scha viele seiner Gufim seinen zersägt und zerspreit geworden über den breiten Jam, und große Fisch und Jamchayas haben sich gesättigt mit sehr Fleisch.
Lord Elohim, may God remember those martyrs who were killed on the ship Titanic. And even though their bodies have been scattered over the wide sea, and large fish and sea creatures have sated themselves with their flesh.
Sollen aber sehr heilige Neshomas sein alle zusammen in ein Platz, beheft mit dein heilige Schchina. Sollen sie alle zusammenständig sein vor deine Augen, und sehr Schuss soll megen sein auf seine Weiber, Kinder, Eltern, Kreuvim, und Kol Yisrael.
May, however, their holy souls be united together in one place with the Holy Shekhinah. May they always be together before your eyes, and may their merit protect their wives, children, parents, relatives, and all of Israel.
So sehr schrecklicher Teut seine Kapore auf unsere Almen sind, und wir sollen behit und beschirmt werden von Wasser und von Feuer und von Kol mine Paroines, bis Hus, was wir seinen jetzt Maske sehr Neshomes, und wir vergessen Tränen auf sehr Teut.
May their terrible deaths be a sacrifice for all our sins. May we be protected and preserved from water, and from fire, and from all kinds of calamities, by merit of how we are now memorializing their souls, and we are spilling tears for their deaths.
Yeah. I don't have anything specific to say for this one, Marna. Did you want to say anything about this one? Save it for the end?
No, I think we should go on to Ida and Isidore.
Yes, we're going to move on.
Yeah, and let me just, for folks who don't know, say a few words about Isidore and Ida Strauss. He was a magnate, very wealthy New York, partial owner of Macy's department store, and they were on the Titanic, not in steerage, but in first class. And as it became clear that the ship was going down and people were scurrying around and pulling out the lifeboats, and it was clear that there wasn't room for everyone, reports are that the cry was women and children first, men stay behind. And Ida was actually in a boat wearing her fur coat, sitting next to her maid, when she realized that Isidore was not climbing in with her, and she climbed out. The maid who survived reported that she took her fur off her shoulders and put it on her shoulders, on the maid's shoulders, and that Ida and Isidore were last seen sitting on the deck holding hands as the lifeboat was launched. And they were memorialized. There were parades, and there was a parade in their memory in New York, and there was a lot of adulation for the Strausses. And I can't remember, Sharon, I think you maybe you remember, ultimately one of their bodies was found and the other never was.
Oh yeah, I can't remember which one.
Yeah.
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 The other thing to note is that whether it's apocryphal or not, this story of Ida Strauss quoting the Book of Ruth, "Wherever you go, I will go," it's authenticated, quote unquote, by I saw an interview with the great granddaughter who says, yes, this is absolutely what she said. So I don't know, but it's interesting because it is repeated in this prayer.
Okay.
And so who knows? I mean, who knows? But it's become part of the legend of Ida Strauss in a very interesting way. So we're going to watch.
We'll read it in a minute. I thought that the writer of the Tkhina had plucked those words out of scripture and put them into her mouth, which I thought was really kind of cool. But whatever.
Apparently, somebody plucked them at some point and put them into her mouth, whether it was her or someone else, which is very interesting. So we're going to read you a little excerpt from this particular Haskora für Isidore und Ida Strauss, memorial prayer for Isidore and Ida Strauss. But it's really for Ida. Let's be honest. These memorial prayers are really about, like, the memorializations of the Strausses are about Ida's bravery and loyalty. So that's something to keep in mind. She's really the important figure here. Yeah, I'm just saying. Okay. Yizkor Elohim. So Gott ermonnen die heiligen Neshomes von Isidor bar Eliezer und Ida bas Rabbi Nossen, die teure und beliebte Poorvolk, was haben getan viel Gutes bei sehr Leben, was seine gegangen Hand in Hand zu helfen Arme und Gedrückte, zu stützen Alte, Kranke und Schwache.
Yizkor Elohim, may God remember the holy souls of Isidore, son of Eliezer, and Ida, daughter of Rabbi Nathan, the dear and beloved couple who did much good during their lives, who went hand in hand to help the poor and oppressed, to support the old, sick, and weak.
Yizkor Elohim, soll Gott ermonnen dem Schus von die zwei nobelen Neshomes, was haben sich euch vereinigen sehr teut bei dem Unglück von der Schiff Titanic. Vashar telech elech, wohin du wirst gehen, will ich euch gehen, hat die nobele Freu gesagt zu ihr Mann.
May God remember the merit of those two noble souls who were also united in death at the tragedy of the ship Titanic. For wherever you go, I will go. Where you go, I will go too, did the noble woman say to her husband.
Und sie hat sich nicht gewollt retten, wissendig, als ihr Mann wird ertrunken werden. Die zwei vereinigten Neshomes seien gefallen, eine die andere auf die Hälse, und seien zusammen gesunken mit Shema Yisrael auf ihre Lippen.
And she didn't want to save herself, knowing that her husband would be drowned. The two united souls embraced each other and sank together with Shema Yisrael on their lips.
So, anything you'd like to say more about this? I mean, I can say something, but no. I mean, I think it's, for me, what is most interesting is this focus on Ida and reciting Ruth's words from the book of Ruth. Again, whether they're apocryphal, I don't know whether
In Hebrew yet, yeah.
in Hebrew yet, and they're repeated in all the stories about her. So whether it's true or not really doesn't matter, right? What matters is the legend. And I think it really speaks to this combination of feminine spirituality and women's speech and the power of women's speech. So it's kind of stands in for the whole genre of Tkhines as a whole, in a way that you've got these textual references and religious observance, and the power of women's spiritual words to other human beings, words to be able to speak directly and personally to God. But there's a power in them. She can do something. I don't know what it is here, but in a lot of the Tkhines, there's a real power in the words, and there's an honoring of women's speech, which I find really interesting. And it's important, this putting she doesn't just say, I want to stay with you. It's not just that noble impulse, it's a noble Jewish impulse by making her speak the words from the book of Ruth. So I find that really interesting. It's made the story specifically Jewish in an important way. Yeah. So that's our formal readings. We have some concluding thoughts, though, we'd like to share, and then we'll open it up to questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll have some time after to have a look at them. Okay. So we're going to share our thoughts. I have some thoughts first, and then Marna's going to share a few little thoughts. A couple of things that I was struck by, just my concluding thoughts after this whole summer reading these Tkhines. The first one that really interested me was this tension between the writer of the Tkhines and the reader, right? How did this woman take it up, especially when the writer was a man, as was often the case, not always, but often. The writer of these Tkhines were men, and the reader was a woman. So what was the intention of them, right? Were they just descriptive of a perspective of a woman of a particular time and place, or were they more proscriptive and normative? Yes, they were probably both. A lot of them we read are really hard to read. A Tkhina who told a woman to pray about her sin caused a soldier to die in the war, or her sin caused something bad to happen to the folks back home, or her sin caused her husband to leave her as an aguna. How much did women think like that? How much did the writer want the women to think like that as a source of piety, self-reflection? I know the concept of one sin having caused bad things to happen is not unknown to Judaism. But as a feminist, I still found it pretty heart-wrenching, sometimes infuriating to read some of these prayers on a personal level, believing that women who are supposed to recite these with kavana, with real intention, believe these things. How could her sin cause a soldier to die in the war? I mean, or her husband to leave her. It just feels awful. But I can also see how at the same time, when you've got a time of uncertainty, pogrom, disease, poverty, the concept that bad things are directly caused by one's own sin and therefore within one's control could be a great comfort. So for me, this was an interesting exploration of spirituality, of Jewish religious thought. Regardless of the intent in this aspect, these prayers do reveal much about the time and place in which these women lived and their concerns, whether that was earning a living, having one's children survive to adulthood, observing Shabbos and Yom Tov as one should. And we can see, particularly in the 1916 book, how these concerns changed over time. Finally, we didn't discuss it, but I do find it intriguing to consider the place of Tkhines in contemporary Jewish society. So what do we make of the fact, and I've read this in various places, that Tkhines are read, or at least gifted to new brides, still today in Hasidic communities and many ultra-Orthodox communities? The Tkhines that we've read today, not the new ones, but the traditional Tkhines, yeah. So what does that mean in their society? And also consider from the opposite, a liberal Jewish feminist perspective. Liberal Jewish feminists have been rediscovering, shall we say, translating these Tkhines many times in places over the last 50 years. So we can think, what role can and do these prayers play in a contemporary feminist Jewish spirituality? And maybe in the future, going forward, can and do these prayers still have a role? So those are my thoughts. Marna, what are your final thoughts?
A lot of the same ones. In studying and analyzing these prayers, I think I was reminded again of the power of traditional liturgical forms to evolve and change to meet changing contemporary needs and circumstances. We didn't have time for it, but I just loved that someone used the prayer for the Tkhina for when a plague breaks out, and used it as a jumping off point for writing a new Tkhina. It was actually called a gebet, but for receiving a vaccination. And I think it was originally written in Hebrew, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it was
Translated
to Yiddish, English, and Hungarian, which is interesting in and of itself. And there are so many that we did not read. We scanned the tables of contents. We plucked out what looked interesting to us. I think we met for 11 or 12 weeks or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's so much that I would love to yet explore. And we're figuring that out. In the future, Sharon and I would like to do more to continue our partnership and facilitate these kinds of groups, and seeing what other texts may be out there that are at the intersection of Yiddish language and women's spirituality. We actually considered this year doing a similar thing with Sana Rena, a women's Torah commentary, and for a variety of reasons we didn't do that. We may yet. But it's very, very wonderful stuff.
Absolutely. So I will Ashenim Dank, a hartzigen Dank. Thank you for joining us. That's our formal presentation. Here are our emails, and you're welcome you'll have my email after the program if you'd like to discuss further or explore some of these texts.
And we have exactly 6 minutes for questions.
No, we can stay a little longer. The Zoom is not going to disappear at 3, but we know folks need to get off to other programs. But we have a little time. We can take some time. So if you have a question or a comment, something you want to discuss, and then we can make the answer, please post it in the Q&A. And we'll have a look right now and see what's in there. I haven't had a chance to look. But if there are any questions, we'll try to answer them now. So please, if you have something that you want to write, put it in the Q&A. Let's see what we have here. So we're going to take a look. Interesting. So Amy Kaufman suggests that, and I love this, like we're making meaning together, we're figuring this out together, that maybe the earlier Tkhines, when I noticed, they were written in the plural. Amy thought perhaps it was a congregational prayer that took place in the synagogue on the taking of the Torah, rather than a personal prayer to be said at home. Now that's an interesting question about whether, speaks to a broader question about whether Tkhines are personal prayers or public prayers. Certainly in the later text, they are exclusively personal. There really aren't any prayers which are designed to be said in a group. But in the earlier texts, I believe there are prayers which are designed to be recited in the synagogue, for example. So probably the women would have recited them together. So it is possible that those prayers were either designed on those earlier prayers, which were, intended for women to read, say in a group, one would read for the others, whoever could read would read. And then that was the jumping off point for producing later Tkhines, and eventually they became exclusively personal. It's an interesting thought. I don't know the exact answer to that, but that is an interesting idea about why that might be, that some of the earlier prayers we read are mir, they're plural we, and then the later prayers in the 20th century are usually I, right? Yes. Yeah. Let's see, any other questions we can answer? Yeah, so Judy Hoffman has a question about the use of the phrase God forbid. And in the Yiddish, it's usually cholila, right? Cholila. It's really an interjection. So Judy Hoffman asks, does this come from religious text conventions or from women saying this is a matter of course, the normal day, as our boobies might? What do you think, Marna? Is like cholila a part of a religious, like a liturgical text? Would you see something like that, or some sort of God forbid kind of?
I don't know what its origin is, but I think probably both, Judy, or some combination of the two.
Do we see it in prayers, a cholila?
No.
No.
I mean, in Hebrew prayers, no.
No. Interesting, eh? It gives them a real personal, it does feel like speech. I mean, they do authentically feel like women's speech, like a woman really personally speaking to God. And these are interjections that you would just throw out.
Yeah, God forbid, God willing.
Yeah, you're not actually talking to God with saying cholila. It's an interjection, Emir Sashem and Kanei Nahora, and these kind of interjections are to ward off good and bad things, happening. But it does give it a feeling of speech, right? It's really interesting. And Judy also asked, were Tkhines in Yiddish read aloud to women so as to reach women who were not able to read? I think initially, yes. I don't think later. I mean, what I know of Tkhines, it's a very private act. It would be, you might read it on Shabbos alone. They were not read in groups, generally, so far as I know.
And I think they were more likely to be read, at home in your kitchen than, communally in shul.
Yeah, those prayers were lost. I think I looked through another 20th century text. They're not present. The communal prayer, like a synagogue prayer, is not present in 20th century text. So by that point, they had long they no longer served a purpose. If you're going to shul, you pray with everyone in shul. And when you're at home, you recite these private prayers for private occasions and private wishes.
I really wish I knew how that little volume that I, found in the books in the shul in Centralia, Washington, that was closing down, like how it got there, whom it had belonged to, how it had been used. It was clearly pretty well used.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting how it ended up? I mean, Yiddish books do tend to end up in libraries. They tend to be discarded and sort of end up passing from one person to the next. I have a few that have ended up on my bookshelf that someone just wanted to find them a home, right? Let's see, any other questions here? Natalie Rose asks about what present-day Tkhina writing is happening and resources. The only ones I know are on the Open Siddur project.
Me too.
So if you go to opensiddur.org and you sort of search for Tkhines, there's a whole section of Tkhines, and some of them are translations of the old ones, like you'll find the translation of Cyril Rappaport there. So the new translations, people are discovering them and translating them, and there are newly written prayers. I don't think it's all that common. I don't know what's happening in Hasidic ultra-Orthodox circles. I have no connection to that, but I would be interested to know. So if anyone knows, let us know. Love to explore those, right? If we had the ability, love to see what's being read and written today. What an interesting question, right? What Yiddish culture creation is happening there? And how does it relate to these older prayers? It's an interesting question. I don't have an answer for that, but I would check out opensiddur.org and see if there's any new Tkhines happening on there.
You just provoked something by what you said a few minutes ago, Sharon, which is that I think it would be really interesting to wander into a bookstore like in Mea Shearim and say, I want to buy a book of Tkhines for a bride. What can you recommend? And see what is being printed and sold and presumably used today in that community.
Yeah. So anyone in Hasidic community wants to go. Shikuns and Matana, send us a little gift. Someone asked me to show our email addresses again, so I'm going to do that. Here are our email addresses. You can contact us, send us a little gift. Because I would love to see that. Let's see, we have any other questions?
Let's see what else. I don't
There's a
think
broader question about how do we study Yiddish. That's a bit of a broader question, I think, that we don't necessarily have time to get into now. Take one of my classes. I'd be happy to share it with you now. But we definitely, both of us come to Yiddish as adults, I think, right, Marna? Did you speak Yiddish as a child?
No, and I think my desire to learn it as an adult is my attempt to do tshuva for not taking advantage of my grandparents when they were around, and would have been delighted, I think, to teach me Yiddish, but no.
Yeah, I started learning after my grandmother passed, and never got the chance to speak with her. So I learned as an adult as well. But yeah, it's a personal connection for me, and it sounds like for you too, Marna. Yeah, I'm not aware of any. Yeah, so it was sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm looking at Ruthie's question.
I know, I'm
about
skimming through, yeah.
written for the hostages. I'm not. It's although some of you may have heard, or in fact be singing in your shuls, Achenu Kol Beit Yisrael, the prayer for the release of the hostages, which is making the liturgical circles today, and it comes from Tachanun, the special supplicatory prayers that are part of the morning service on Mondays and Thursdays, and Tachanun and Tachina are etymologically related, but that's just that. No, I'm not.
So I think that's the end that I can see for questions that are mainly that I think other ones I think we've sort of answered. So I think we're going to end it there, because I think we've answered most of the questions. As I said, you're welcome to contact us if you want to discuss further. And we thank you all so much for joining us.
And thank you, Marna and Sharon, for a really wonderful presentation. It was so interesting, and how people respond to contemporary events of their time, I thought was really something I knew nothing about, and I'm very happy that you've shared your knowledge with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah. Bye-bye.